Okay, so now that we've learned that these are inverse functions of each other, now let's look at the information that we need to know about log graphs. So for exponentials, the domain is negative infinity. You should be able to see when we look at this exponential graph over here, as we go from left to right, which is where we read, the way we read domain, we don't have any negative x values over here. So that means that my domain is no longer negative infinity to positive infinity. But remember, that's because we switched the x and the y values. So what that should mean is whatever was true for the x values of the exponential function is now true for the y values. So for logs, my range is the one that's negative infinity to positive infinity. And you should be able to see that right here as we read from bottom up. We have an arrow that's going, to negative, pointing toward negative infinity. So as we know, it starts at negative infinity. And we have this arrow that's kind of pointing over to the right, but as it goes to the right, it does continue to move on up. So it's moving up slowly. It's moving right faster than it's moving up, but it does go toward the right and up. So it is approaching positive infinity. So the domain of negative infinity to positive infinity, or all real numbers for the exponential, becomes the range of the logs. And the same is true for the range. We have an asymptote that cuts us off over here. We have a horizontal asymptote, which is the x-axis. So that means the logs have the vertical asymptote. The y-axis right here, and I'm going to kind of slash it like this. That's the vertical asymptote. It is the y-axis, but what that means is it acts as a boundary line. So my domain is never negative. So it starts where my x values are 0, and then it does go to infinity, but I'm not ever going to have any negative x values when I'm graphing a log, unless I do some transformations and I slide it past that way. But for the parent function, which for this one, this is, remember what I told you, this is log base 2 of x. That's the parent function that we're looking at. Remember, for algebra 2, we do base 2, base 10, and e. And base 2, we do write the little 2 right there. When we do base 10, we're not going to write anything at all. It's an understood base 10 right there. It's called a common log. And then we do something really weird. When our base is the e, we don't even put the word log. We do ln, which stands for natural log. And I know the log of the natural exponential, that's really what it is. We're taking the log of the natural exponential. That's the equation for the natural log e, for the log of the natural exponential e. So those were the 3 parent functions, and this really, since I'm not giving you an x or y values on the x-axis, this really could be any of those 3. They all look pretty much the same. I'll show them all 3 to you in just a second when I switch over to Desmos. Again, the asymptote here is the vertical line, the y-axis. The y-axis is the name of that line. The equation is x equals 0 because that line is crossing the x-axis, and it's crossing the x-axis at 0. So the equation is x equals 0. And the end behavior is going to switch just like everything else did. Our domain switched to the range. Our range switched to the domain. Our asymptote was horizontal. Now my asymptote is vertical. And my end behaviors are going to switch. So normally on this one, I went, I looked at going to negative infinity on the x-axis and then positive infinity on the x-axis. Remember, I don't go to negative infinity on the x-axis. So over here, it was my y value that approached the asymptote. So what's going to happen over here? It's going to be my x value that's approaching the asymptote. So my x value is not going to go left. My x value approaches the asymptote. And as my x value approaches the asymptote, my y value is going to negative infinity. And then, but on the other side, my x value does go to the right forever. So on the right side, my y values are going up. And I left off my arrow somewhere. My y is approaching negative. Okay, so As I approach my asymptote, my vertical asymptote, my graph goes to negative infinity. And then as I go toward positive infinity on the right side of the x-axis, my graph goes up. So everything switched. Domain became range, range became domain, horizontal asymptote became a vertical asymptote, and my y approached my asymptote, and now my x approaches my asymptote.